Greetings, AP European History scholars, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom on Unit 1 on the Renaissance, the Rise of Nation-States, and Exploration. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance is a period of rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of learning, a renewed appreciation of antiquity, of the writings and the art of the Greeks and the Romans. The difference between the Italian and the Northern Renaissance: the Northern Renaissance, as a generalization in brief, was more religious. And the Northern Renaissance is also hearkening back to antiquity, but they're focusing not so much on pagans. They're not focusing on, for example, Ovid and Virgil and Cicero, but they're looking back to the old Hebrew and Greek scriptures for the purpose of reforming the church. An example would be Erasmus's New Greek New Testament and his criticism of the church, the corruption in the Catholic Church, in his The Praise of Folly, which is one of the most explosive documents of the Renaissance. And the focus of The Praise of Folly is purifying the church and returning to the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ, the morality of Christ. Why was the Renaissance where it was? Well, you have these trade routes in the Mediterranean, which are passing through Italy and controlled by many of the navies of these Italian cities, such as Venice. And Italy is this focal point of trade between what would be the Middle East and Asia, going through the Middle East to the rest of Europe. In Northern Europe, you have along the Baltic and North Sea, you have these German cities. For example, the Hanseatic League is this sort of confederation of cities that are profiting from this trade, this water trade along this area here. And this trade in Italy and along the North Sea is generating great wealth for a rising middle class, which is going to be subsidizing and patronizing art. The vernacular refers to writing in the language of the common people instead of Latin. You should know Johannes Gutenberg, who invents the movable type printing press, and the significance is this makes the spread of knowledge easy, it makes it cheap, it makes it fast, and all sorts of ideas, whether it's Renaissance ideas, the ideas on individualism, later Reformation ideas challenging religious conformity. The Renaissance women of note, and generally, keep in mind, probably 90% of women, like 90% of men, are illiterate and are working basically in farms. But middle-class women, like middle-class men, are getting some education here. The middle-class woman is supposed to make her husband look good. If there's a party, she's supposed to be able to maybe recite poetry, play an instrument. She is supposed to be involved in the education of her children. She's an adornment of the house. But there are some Renaissance women of particular note. A few: Isabel d'Este in Mantua was a regent when her husband, who was a diplomat, was off doing his diplomat things, and she's also a famous patroness of the arts. You've got Kristin Pisan, who is an Italian woman who marries a Frenchman. He goes off and dies, and she's going to support her children and rest of her family, extended family, through writing essays and all sorts of things. So she's a woman who is widely read, and people bought her stuff. Some queens of note, and the queens are exceptions that sort of prove the rule, but you do have Isabel, who marries Ferdinand in Spain, and I think this is in 1469, and this unification of Spain is going to lead to defeat of the Moors finally in the Battle of Granada, and you're going to have a unitary nation state where the Moors have been defeated and forced to leave or convert. Elizabeth in England is going to, while the rest of Europe is tearing itself apart in religious wars, is going to follow this via media, this Elizabethan settlement, this middle way of not official toleration, but de facto toleration. She's not, a quote of hers is, she's not wanting to look into the hearts of men, and she's keeping England prosperous and at peace during this time of religious war. And you have this Elizabethan age of literary flowering of Marlowe and Spenser, and most famously Shakespeare. And she's also the queen when it's her fleet that is going to defeat the Spanish Armada when it tries to invade in 1588. You have Catherine de' Medici, who is the queen mother in France. When her husband dies, she's got these children and she's going to defend them, in part by launching the Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which is the beginning of the Wars of Religion in France. And she is massacring Huguenots. And the Huguenots are French Protestants, but they're also, many of the contenders to the throne are these families of Huguenots. So Catherine de' Medici is a woman who uses a certain amount of brutality to protect her offspring's claim to the throne. And one of the ironies here at the very end of when her sons die, her daughter is going to marry Henry Navarre, Henry IV, who is a Huguenot, although he does convert. Remember, this will be in the next unit we cover, but Paris is worth the mass. Petrarch, why is he so famous? He is an Italian humanist. He's fascinated with the ancient Latin writers, and he is a collector of documents. He's a collector of old Latin documents, and he writes letters to the writers of antiquity because of his fascination with them. Baldassare Castiglione, who he's the author of The Courtier, and he's an advocate of what we call civic humanism. You want to be a well-rounded Renaissance man for the purpose of serving in a prince's court. You want to be a well-rounded bureaucrat. And he's advocating military skill, being able to play music, being able to dance, knowing history, knowing the classics. You want to be a person who's well-versed, who's useful to somebody in power. Pico de Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man has been called the manifesto of the Renaissance. In it, he declares that man has free will. Man has the potential to make himself better. Now, this is an idea from antiquity, but it's also not in contradiction to Christianity, because he says man has free will because God has given it to man. That man has something that the animals and the angels don't have. Man has the ability to make himself better, to surpass the state where he is in now. Machiavelli's The Prince is a book of advice to the Medici ruler based upon self-interest, what works to maintain power. And what's interesting in this book is that he's not appealing to Christian moral values, but he's appealing to basically the end justifying the means. You can be sly, you can lie, you can be harsh, whatever it takes to keep order. And it should be noted here, at least I don't believe he's a sadist or he means to be cruel, but if the problem with Italian cities between themselves and concerning invasions by the Holy Roman Empire and France, if the problem is disunity, and if the problem is anarchy, you need to have a strong hand to keep order and for defense. So he has this other famous quote, "It's better to be feared than loved." Order brings peace, order brings prosperity, order brings protection. Raphael's School of Athens. Raphael is an Italian Renaissance painter, and this is a very interesting painting that was in the Pope's library. Of all places, this is a painting full of pagans, pagan scholars, pagan philosophers, pagan mathematicians. In the center are Aristotle and Plato, surrounded by Greek artists, scholars, and scientists. You've got Euclid, you've got Pythagoras, you've got in the corner niches of this space two Greek gods. You have on our left, looking at the painting, you have Apollo, the god of light and music, and on our right you have Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom. So this is quite a tribute to ancient learning and reason. Donatello and Michelangelo's David. Donatello's David is the first freestanding bronze since antiquity, and then you see realism. You see this sort of pubescent adolescent boy, this little tiny sort of skinny kid, and he's naked, and it's kind of a glorification of the human body, a recognition that of humanity, and he's straddling between his legs the head of Goliath, which he has just cut off with the sword that he's leaning on. But you see this realism, this naked kid, this boy is very realistic in its portrayal. Michelangelo's David is also very realistic, but this is really a copy of the Polykritos, famous Greek statue, and the Michelangelo David is 17 feet tall. So this is David. This is the David who the Lord loved and said was, just a very godly man, a man who wrote the Psalms. king of Israel, a man who repented at the right time, a man who honored. I mean, this is a very Christian man who is being made into a statue, but it's a 17-foot naked man, and it is showing man in all his naked glory. So these are very realistic statues, but they're saying something about the nature of man as well as portraying a religious figure, as well as copying ancient Greek statues. Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Wedding. This is an example of popular portrait art of the rich in the Northern Renaissance. As in the Southern Renaissance, there's a lot of money being poured into portrait art of yourself, of your family. And this very detailed painting might have been done with what's called camera obscura. This might have been done by looking through a lens that would reflect an image on a canvas, so you could basically trace the image. Brunelleschi's Dome. The Florence Cathedral basically has copied the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, which is a Roman, a Latin architectural example of antiquity. And this at the time was the biggest church in Christendom. Sandro Botticelli is the artist who does the Birth of Venus, who does Primavera, and these are pagan themes. Birth of Venus, this is the goddess of love who's being born out of the ocean, and there's nothing remotely Christian here. This southern Renaissance, or maybe that's not quite how we want to say it, south of the northern Renaissance, but northern Italy. This is an example of pagan depreciation of pagan art for pagan art's sake. Renaissance art techniques: the use of perspective, the use of vanishing point, the use of chiaroscuro, which is the use of shading to give three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional surface. And you have contrapposto. Contrapposto is this weight shift, where instead of the stiff standing like maybe Egyptian art, you have kind of a natural shift in the hips, showing some realistic posture. 1492 Reconquista, the effect on Spain and on exploration overseas. This is a couple decades after Isabel and Ferdinand unite Spain after driving out the Moors mostly. This is a triple date. 1492, some of you may remember, is when Columbus sails the ocean blue. He's sailing with the funding of the Spanish court in Madrid. This is also the year the last battle against the Moors takes place at Granada, and the Moors are defeated. It's also the year where Ferdinand and Isabel, to bring religious conformity to Spain, kick out the Jews and kick out whatever remaining Moors there are, or your option is to convert, and an inquisition is set up to make sure you are truthful in your conversion. But Spain is going to begin its spread of its culture and its religion overseas to Latin America, beginning in 1492 with Columbus's first voyage to America. How did monarchs gain power, and how did they maintain power? Just some quick thoughts on three countries. In Spain, Isabel and Ferdinand gained power through marriage, through uniting two kingdoms into a much more powerful nucleus of modern-day Spain, and they are going to maintain power by defeating the Moors, by kicking them out and demanding the conversion for those people who are not Catholic, or to get out. And there's this mass expulsion of Jews, mostly northward, although some head over towards the Eastern Mediterranean, notably Greece. The English have a civil war, the War of the Roses, and the House of Tudor, or the House of Lancaster, the Tudor family, is going to win this war. And Henry VII is going to set up the Star Chamber. This is a sort of a super court in the country which is going to rule over the feudal courts of various lords, and the feudal lords are going to be prohibited from livery and maintenance, which is controlling their own little private armies. So power is being concentrated in the hands of the Tudor dynasty, and Henry VII is the father of the more famous Henry VIII, which we'll get to in our next unit, the guy that marries and divorces all those women, kills some of them. And in France, at the end of the 100 Years' War takes place, and England is finally, after a century of fighting for control of parts of France, England is defeated by the armies of Joan of Arc. So you have a military victory here, putting the Valois dynasty in place here after a war that just shreds France for the longest time. The Holy Roman Empire, where was it? And something about the dynasty. It is approximately where Germany today is. The German states and what would be Austria are being ruled by the Habsburg ruler. The Habsburg dynasty is a dynasty that's going to last for quite a while. And the Habsburg emperor is elected by 7 electors. These are powerful German states that are choosing the Habsburg emperor, or the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. And tradition here is that it is a Habsburg. But the Habsburg ruler is going to be indebted to these electors. And you're going to see this when Martin Luther, this rebel monk reformer, is going to be protected by Frederick of Saxony, one of the electors from the Holy Roman Emperor, as sort of a point of defiance and independence. But you have division in both what was modern-day Germany and Italy all the way up until 1870, 1871. There is disunity, which is in contrast to what's going on in England, France, and Spain. How are they able to explore across the globe? Well, some technological improvements. You have the Caravel, which is a ship with maneuverable sails, which was very fast, very maneuverable. You have improved cartography, map making, especially at this School of Navigation and Exploration in Portugal under Henry the Navigator. You have better navigation through the adoption of the compass, which is an Eastern Asian tool, and some new navigation tools that allow you to figure out where you are in the middle of the ocean by looking up at the stars. And that would be the astrolabe, the quadrant, and the sextant. So you can know where you are and your direction. Spanish encomiendas are Spanish farms, Spanish plantations, as it were, that used forced Indian labor. And there's this idea that these Indians are being commended. Encomendar in Spanish means to commend. So what do the Indians get out of this? They're being commended to be civilized and to be Christianized. In return, they're supposed to provide labor. The Indians will die off in much of America, from North America down to the bottom of South America, by disease and by overwork, by hunger, and by some killing with superior European technology. And this is going to open the door to, it's going to lead to the enslavement of Africans. And there is precedent for this off of these islands off the coast of Africa that Portugal and Spain owned: Madeira, the Azores, the Canary Islands. Slavery is going to be planted in the Caribbean, and only about 10% of these slaves actually end up in North America. But many are going to be going down to Brazil, and this Indians, as they die off, are going to be replaced by black slaves. Bartholomew de las Casas, or Bartolomé de las Casas, he is worth knowing about. He's a Spanish priest who asked for fair treatment of the Indians. And he represents a path which basically nobody went down, but he's asking for the Indians to be treated as human beings. And Indians were treated as savages. They were treated as pagans. Their land was stolen from them. Their women were violated. Their crops were destroyed. I mean, it's a shameful story. Basically, everybody mistreated the Indians, pretty much, less so the French and the Dutch. But Bartholomew de las Casas was an advocate for treating them Christianly. The Columbian Exchange refers to the movement of plants and animals, fauna and flora across the Atlantic in both directions. From Europe to the Americas, you get large animals. You get horses. These are creatures which were not known in the Americas. You get horses, you get cows, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens. You get wheat and barley and oats. And what's going the other way? Corn, potatoes, tomatoes to Europe. No Italian had seen a tomato until it was brought over by Columbus and company. And citrus to America. That's coming from basically the Middle East and via Spain, but there weren't any oranges, say, in Florida until the Columbian Exchange brought them over. You, of course, see white Europeans moving over to places in French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch settlements, and you see black African slaves being brought over as well. So there's kind of a drive-by review. Everything on this review sheet class will be somewhere on your test. So heads up, study early, study well, know these things. Good luck to you all. Signing out.